what I'm briefly going to talk to you today about is how HSE sees the assessment of radon risk working out for people who are required to work from home by their employer. Now, clearly that has been the case for many months and is likely to continue for some more. And people's ways of working are obviously changing too. So the first thing we need to do is look at the sort of legislation that is relevant to occupational radon exposure and people who are involved in a work activity whilst working at home. Clearly, the first and most important one is the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act 1974, which is the overarching Health and Safety Act that under which various different regulations are made. It's been enforced, obviously, for a very long time, works very well. And under those, under that Act, we have two other sets of regulations. One is known as the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999. Commonly referred to as the management regs, and the set of regulations I'm sure you're all very familiar with, the ionizing radiations regulations 2017. So when looking at people's radon exposure whilst working at home, we must have due cognizance of what these three pieces of legislation require. So firstly, looking at the management regs apply to all workers required by their employer to work from home during the period of the COVID-19 pandemic or at other times. What it says is that every employer should make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks to health and safety of his employees to which they are exposed whilst at work, and for the purposes of identifying the measures he needs to take in order to comply with the requirements and prohibitions imposed upon him by or under relevant statutory provisions. And if you look very carefully at the Health and Safety at Work Act, dig out some of the more archaic things in the back, it says an employee under section 52(1)(b) is at work throughout the time when he is in the course of his employment or otherwise. Thus, if someone is sat at home sending out emails, drafting contracts, other documentations, reviewing evidence, and so on, and they're doing that for their employer, they are at work, and therefore all those bits of legislation that I've already illustrated apply. So we've established that under the management regs, people who are at work, the employer needs to assess the risks and take control measures to appropriately minimize those risks. And therefore, this is what they should do. They have to make an assessment under Regulation 5.1 to give shall make and give effect to such arrangements as are appropriate having regards to the nature of their activities and the size of the undertaking for the effective planning, organisation, control, monitoring, review of the preventative protective measures. So what that means in summary, or summarising the last few slides, is that employers should assess the risks to people's health and safety whilst they're at home working. The employer should go through the risks identified and see whether there's anything they can do to minimize or restrict exposure to specific risks. With, however, the overarching thing that the law requires the employer only to do things that are reasonable. Okay, I'm not going to go into the definition of reasonable. I'm sure you're all familiar with it and know what is unreasonable. So, given all of that, what is HSE's view for people who are exposed to radon whilst working at home? What we would like employers to do under this legislation is, in practice, the employer must carry out a risk assessment and put in place measures to reduce the risks that an employee is exposed to whilst working at home, with the overarching thing of being reasonable, of course. So what this means is exposure to naturally occurring radon gas in those parts of the UK where there are high radon levels are known to be present, or exposure happens because people are working in their basements or cellar, etc. This is one of the risks the employers need to consider as part of their duties under the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. So they have to consider the risks associated with radon exposure and home working as part of their risk assessment. But as I've said, as with all approaches to controlling risk, whether they're actually in a factory or an office or for people working at home, they are only required to do what is reasonable. So what I'm about to tell you is what HSE has sort of said is reasonable for an employer to do for people who are working at home and are likely to be exposed to radon. What we're saying is most people who live in a radon affected area already know they are in a radon affected area and are already taking the necessary steps to protect themselves and others whilst they're at home. And if an employer has identified this as part of their risk assessment, they should consider that particular factor. If the cost of any mitigation that the employee and the employer may come to the conclusion is required is not reasonable compared to the risk, then mitigation steps are not required. In such cases, though, it might not be reasonable for the employer to expect the employee to work from home given their increased risk. And the ionizing radiations regulations say that if an employee is exposed to a level above 300 becquerels per cubic meter averaged over a year, then the ionizing radiations regulations apply to that exposure, and they must also notify the HSE that their employees are exposed to that level. So what are we saying the employer should do? Act reasonably and proportionately. Determine if the employee's home is in a radon affected area. Determine if the employee's works in a basement or a cellar. If yes to either of those particular questions, has the employee already measured the radon level in their home? If so, what is it? And have they taken any remedial action? And ask themselves, do I, the employer, need to measure radon levels in that particular home? And also, do I need to take any remedial action as a result of those measurements? So that was a really rapid run through. I hope you've got the gist of that. I notice I've got a few minutes left for some questions and observations. So if that's okay with you, Rebecca.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, James. That was, really clear overview there. And the take-home message there is if you've got employees working at home, then if they're in an affected area, their house should be tested. I personally I think you said, most people, you assume that people living in radon affected areas, they'll know about radon and they may have tested their homes. I would probably say that's not necessarily true in a lot of cases. So what I wondered was, HSE have a record of employers where they've had to notify that they have a site, the workplace is over 300 becquerels. Is there any scope for HSE to contact those employers to say it's likely that your employees live in the vicinity? If they're now working at home, make sure that they know that they're in a radon affected area, and have they tested?
That is not something we've considered doing, but now you've mentioned it, maybe we will consider it. However, the problem with that is if you look at the number of notifications we have got under the ionizing radiations regulations, let me put it in common parlance, it doesn't look right. We've only about 100. There must be many more employers with higher radon levels that require notification. So yeah, something that I'll have to think about and talk to my colleagues, see what they say.
It would be a starting point, and perhaps
it would.
Notified you are the proactive ones who have done the testing and then hopefully have put remediation in place if necessary in the workplace. Staff then may have been aware that what was going on. If the employer had done what they were meant to and let the employees know that there'd been high radon levels, then you would hope that that message, they may have seen it happening at work, so they might be more receptive to it at home.
Indeed, but you could also argue that the employer knows that their premises are in a radon affected area. So if they have got home workers who live close by, you'd expect them as part of their risk assessment to actually say, hang on a minute, you might have some radon problems in your house.
Yes, you would hope they might, but I'm assuming that, yeah, you haven't had many of those. So
but that does seeg into something that I thought about telling you, and I will tell you. We have just learned a few months ago of a school in a particular part of the area that has got very, very high radon levels associated, well, in their premises, and as a result of that, we are writing to, I think it's just under 100 schools in the area to say, radon, you need to do an assessment, etc. So some of those of you that operate a radon measurement service may well be getting a short influx of requests for your meters and dose meters.
That's good to know, and good to know that that there is some proactivity in contacting other nearby once you get notified by one.
Well, we felt that we were not only duty bound but morally obliged to actually say to the other schools in the area, you need to do something about radon. So yes, you're right, we were proactive in that particular. We were reactive initially, but we're now being proactive.
Fantastic. Have you got time for a couple of questions?
Yep, sure.
So first one's probably going to be a quick answer. Have HSE received any notifications under IRR 17 from employers for home working employees? Or would you not be able to identify?
I wouldn't be able to identify that because all they're required to do is tell us who they are and where they are. They're not required to tell us the details of their premises. And obviously, if they've got people working at home, my gut reaction is I would very much doubt we've had any notifications like that.
Next question is, if employers identify a requirement to test a home location, what happens if the homeowner or the employee refuses to have the test carried out at their house, and where does the employee stand, or where does the employer stand in that situation?
Okay, so let's look at it from an enforcement point of view. If I was to knock on the door of the employer and say, what have you done about radon exposure for your employees who are working at home? And they said to me, well, we told Mr. So-and-so that he got a problem with radon. We were even prepared to put up some passive radon monitors. He refused to allow us to do that. But we reiterated there is likely to be a radon risk in his house, and he still refused. I'd go, fine, that's all you need to do, which I think sort of answers your question.
So as long as they've got a record that they've attempted to do the risk assessment.
Yeah.
Okay.
There is nothing in law which compels an employee to do what their employer tells them to do in that particular respect.
Interesting conundrum. Okay, I've got one here about peripatetic workers, such as basement waterproofers, who might work in different basements throughout the year, accumulating exposure. What's the position of HSE to protect them if they haven't got a fixed place of work, but they are working in areas that are likely to receive high exposure?
Yeah, I've had this similar question before. Well, the answer is I don't care how many premises they're working at. The employer is required to carry out a risk assessment. So if they have employees who are working in basements, they should be doing a radon risk assessment, whether or not they're working in 1 or 200.
Okay. So would you expect them to have some sort of personal dosimeters?
It depends upon where the basements were and what the risk assessment said. But certainly, if they were working on a regular basis in radon affected areas, whether they're in cellars or not, then you would need to look at the possibility of requiring them to have personal dosimeters.
Okay. One final question, because I know you need to leave. One here that says, if radon levels in an employee's home are more than 300 becquerels, but the cost of remediation is not reasonable, should an employer consider stating that that employee cannot work from home, assuming there's an office available, to minimise their exposure?
That's something that could be considered. If the remediation is not reasonable, it's going to cost, £10,000 to reduce the level by 50 becquerels per cubic meter. It's probably not reasonable. Again, I can't interject in discussions like that between an employee and an employer, but I would imagine the employer will say, well, we can't really remediate. It's not reasonable for us to do so. There is a risk associated with this. We would prefer it if you worked from the office. The employee might say, okay, I acknowledge that, but to be frank, I don't care. I'll sit here and breathe in radon rather than get COVID by coming into the office. So as with many of the things that I've discussed this morning, it's sort of a negotiation between the employee and the employer. But I mean, the baseline here should be if there's employees working at a high radon level that you can't properly remediate, then you should remove them from that radon area, if possible.
Interesting. Opens up, yeah, working from home opens up a whole new dimension of challenges for employers when they're considering taking people on contracts. Where are they going to be? And I guess for all health and safety risks, managing that when it's someone's home.
Yeah, I mean, my employer provided me with a huge screen, a properly adjustable chair, various other different things. But have they asked me about other hazards in my house? Yes-ish, but not really. There is a balance to be struck. It's all about proportionality and reasonableness.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, James. We'll leave it there. I know you need to get off. Thank you for that update. The slides will be circulated to everyone afterwards, and James's details are on there. So if anyone has got any more questions, please contact James.